History of Bilingual Education by Sarah Ennis. So at first there was no language policies. In the early American days, many people spoke multiple languages. Bilingual education was common and it was encouraged. Once America started its education program, we had to decide what to teach in schools. It became up to the states what language they wanted to teach. Most of the northern cities like Baltimore, Cincinnati, Cleveland, and St. Louis taught in German English schools. Ohio made a law in 1839 that authorized the instruction of both English and German. The parents could choose if their child would learn both. Other states followed suit. Louisiana made an identical statute, but with French and English. And then in 1848, the territory of New Mexico made an identical statute as well, but it was with Spanish and English. Unfortunately, this would soon change. The first federal language law. By this time, America was moving towards English only, not only in schools, but also in communities. In Congress in 1906, they passed the first federal language law that required someone to speak English for naturalization. This was a part of the initiative to Americanize America. This federal law brought a lot of state laws, which caused over 18,000 people to be charged for speaking English, for not only speaking English, but speaking another language. This will have a rippling effect on ELLs because this would hinder them in their education because half of their identity was outlawed. The Meyer versus Nebraska case. This case is famous for helping remove a lot of the more restrictive language laws. In 1923, a periodical teacher read the Bible to a 10-year-old in German. By this time, the Americanization of America started to die down, so the Supreme Court ruled to lift a lot of restrictions on teaching foreign languages because of this case. This will affect the education of ELLs because it is when the education department started to realize that teaching other languages isn't a bad thing. It was actually a good, beneficial thing. It would also help them in the long run when they started to learn English, and they could also continue to learn their first language. So Brown versus Board of Education. This is a case that we hear about a lot in our education courses. But the Brown versus the Board of Education is an important case for a lot of the America's education departments. It is a segregation case. This case, along with other segregation cases, made it clear that ELLs cannot be fully separated from other students. A lot of the states at this time believed if they said that they were teaching ELLs English, then they could be separated throughout their whole educational career. But in 1954, that myth was laid to rest. So that was the way of the education department saying that you actually do need to teach these students inside a regular classroom with English-only students, but also provide them with those resources that they need. It also made it clear that the state's job to provide students with equal educational opportunities was something that they needed to do, and this was a way to give higher quality bilingual programs, which would help ELL students in the long run when they are trying to learn both English and their native language. So the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. Before the late 1960s, English language learners, or ELLs, didn't have any federal policies on their education. Many students' needs were ignored and were thrown into regular English-only classrooms. This was a method of the sink or swim. The students were expected to either rise up and figure out how to learn, or they would ultimately drop out. By 1965, the English language learners' educations began to improve. This was when the Civil Rights Movement was in full swing. This is also during the time of President Lyndon B. Johnson's War on Poverty. The Elementary and Secondary Education Act was passed in 1965. This act had funding, policies, and procedures laid out inside of it. And this also targeted lower income students. This was a turning point in the ELL's education because from here on out, more policies and regulations were being made. Therefore, their education was being taken serious, and that they were moving towards a more quality education. ESSA, or Elementary and Secondary Education Act has been under constant changes. We see now in this act Title VII, which provides grants to school districts, and it was added to ESSA in 1968. Since 1968, ESSA has been reauthorized 6 different times. Each time it has been upgraded and revised to fit the needs of the current ELL students. So Law versus Nicholas case. In 1974, Chinese American students who weren't proficient in English were being placed in mainstream classes to sink or swim. The Supreme Court ruled that putting Chinese Americans in a mainstream classroom wasn't fair. This was an important case for ELL's education because it finally put in writing that just because students have the same amenities as each other, it doesn't make it an equal learning environment. This was basically that students that weren't proficient in English being put in mainstream classes with the same textbooks and the same instruction as students that are English-only students wasn't giving them a fair educational opportunity. And that was one thing that this case brought. This would lead to the creation of the Law Remedies. And this program went after school districts that weren't meeting the needs of ELL students, and it would lead to the creation of the EEOA. So this case was very important to the ELL education because it started regulating the school districts, and it was a process of making sure that those school districts were focusing on the ELL's needs and requirements that they needed for those bilingual programs. So the Equal Educational Opportunities Act of 1974, or the EEOA, this was put into place after the Law and Nicholas case. This act stated that no state shall deny educational opportunities to an individual on account of his or her race, color, sex, or national origin by the failure of an educational agency to take appropriate action to overcome language barriers that impede equal participation by its students in its instructional programs. This was from Wright, 2007, and on 2017, page 84. It was the only act that has a few regulations on the bilingual education. This is unusual because other legal actions have been made to make it clear that the Supreme Court doesn't mandate bilingual education. And this helps ELL education because it protects their right to an equal educational opportunities, and it is really the only act that deals with bilingual education. So a lot of court cases will use this act to help them in their case. The Casadilla versus Pickard case. So in 1981, Casadilla versus Pickard was tried in Texas. The ruling was that the Raymondville School District fell short of meeting the requirements of the EEOA. A major outcome was the 3-pronged test. This test would determine if schools were taking appropriate action to address the needs of ELLs. The test had 3 prongs. The first prong mandated that ELL programs are based on the sound educational theory. The second prong is if the programs are implemented effectively with sufficient resources and personnel. And the third prong is that the programs are evaluated to determine whether they are effective in helping students overcome language barriers. This 3-prong test is called the Casadilla standard. It has become the essential point in seeing if ELL programs are benefiting students. This case has helped shape ELL's education because it regulates if the program is following the requirements to help students. So, No Child Left Behind. No Child Left Behind was signed into law by President George W. Bush. It was made because of the concern of the American education system wasn't internationally competitive. This act increased the federal government's role in holding schools responsible for academic progress of each student. It also put a focus on states pushing up certain groups like the ELLs, SPED students, and low-income students and students in minority groups. Another aspect of the No Child Left Behind is the standardized testing. This was a way for the federal government to make sure students are learning. This helps ELLs because it puts them in a higher need to succeed. Teachers are now focusing on how they're doing rather than them being on the back burner. And lastly, the 2002 ballot law. So in 2002, Massachusetts, the ballot law was passed. The law required English learners to be taught in sheltered immersion programs. This wasn't helpful to students because they each brought different needs and they were unable to use their skills in realistic manners. It also didn't help close the achievement gap between ELLs and native English speakers. With more than 90,244 ELL students in the state, something needed to be done. In November 2017, the Massachusetts Governor, Charlie Baker, signed a new bill into law. He said that the new law would preserve the existing approach that works well for many students while providing school districts with the opportunity to adapt alternative, credible ways to teach English that may be more beneficial to certain students. This bill would allow school districts to continue with to use the immersion classes that they were already using, but also different approaches to meet the needs of their students. Also, under this bill, the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education would develop seals of biliteracy for the high school diplomas. This would show colleges that students had important skills in dual language and were prepared to bring them into the real world. Throughout the American history, ELL's education has been on a roller coaster. It continues to be revised and grow to better these students. These were the most important cases that I believe kind of showcased what struggles the ELL students have gone through. And then these are the different resources that I used.